Hello, welcome to my channel. Today I have some really scary stories lined up for you. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Get comfortable and listen to the best spooky tales. Although much ridiculed as a childish fear, awareness of the dark is an instinct, which has through millions of years of evolution, become ingrained on our subconscious. Even a fully grown manly man, 6 foot something with rippling biceps and sturdy facial hair, cannot deny in all honesty that he has never looked into a dark space and wondered, without meaning to, what might be looking back. Children are, without question, far more at one with their instincts than adult humans can possibly be, as we learn about the vast intricacies of modern culture by our parents, teachers, and experiences. We lose clear communication with our inner voice. For it is this voice which warns you when an unseen danger is nearby, giving you temporarily heightened senses in order to safely escape the hazard. It is this voice, too, which asks you to question whether you're going about unseen when wandering in the dark. The truth in its most basic and raw form is that you are never unseen, unnoticed, or unwatched. Just as people are prone to stopping and watching animals in a park or slowing down on the motorway to survey the carnage of a recent accident, so people are observed by those who wish not to be known. It is widely believed by those who are of an understanding that we are not alone in the shadow, that our instinctual voice chooses to become nothing more than a nagging feeling in the backs of our minds by the time we reach adulthood. For if it were not so, we would be consciously aware of our voyeurs, and this would cause them enormous displeasure. Not only would we be aware of them, but we would be able to hear them. In order to explain this as well as I am capable, I will tell you the story of a young woman whom we will name LA in order to maintain her privacy and to distance ourselves from the situation as much as possible. I implore you, before reading on, to never attempt the same actions as Adele. Never do as she did, or you will become what she has become. You will lose yourself to the darkness. Lala was in her mid-30s, divorced and child, living once more with her parents in their handsome 4-bed, somewhere in the suburbs of London. Elle worked as a freelance journalist and did most of her writing from the room her parents had kindly set up as a study for her. It was one of the back bedrooms, an odd shape with 5 walls rather than 4. Bookcases lined 2 of the walls, a large bay window dominated the back of the room, and a broad fireplace stood proudly in the center. Above it was an ornate Victorian mirror LA's mother had bought at a church fete almost 2 decades before. The window never faced the sun, and the chintzy lampshade overhead did little to cast light into the room. It was uninspiring and dim, but Elle had not been asked to pay rent during the financial fallout of her divorce, and she refused to complain about their kindness. While writing, Elle would often hit a block, jump to her feet, and pace back and forth while her mind scrambled around, trying to find the right words. Once she had them, she would dive back down into the chair and type away furiously. This cycle would be repeated numerous times during a few hours of writing. It came to the point that LA would close her eyes while she did it, able to track her movements back and forth across the room by the squeezing floorboard on her 4th step and the cool hint of a draft as she crossed the path of the fireplace's mouth. It was late October, and she was writing a frustratingly fluffy piece about mental health in the winter months when LA did something she hadn't done before during once of her pacing runs. She opened her eyes as she turned back toward her desk. It was a split second, almost too quick to see, and yet she knew she had seen it. In the mirror behind her own haggard reflection, something had moved in the dim shadows between the bookcases. On instinct, she immediately looked to the shadowy space and found it, unsurprisingly to her adult mind, to be unoccupied. Just a trick of the light, she muttered to herself and settled back down to her work. Later, after giving up on an article that refused to be written, she shut down her laptop and, as she stepped out of the room, glanced back once more. Once again, it was only a split second. But she had seen it. The first time, she had shaken it off without trouble. The second time was not quite so easy, in bed. That night, she read until her eyes were burning from the strain, and the words on the page were turning into a blurred mass of meaningless letters. Putting the book on the nightstand, she clicked off the lamp without thought and settled back against the pillows. Her mind, addled with tiredness and stress, found itself unable to suppress her inner voice. Can you hear that? It was white noise, nothing more. That almost high-pitched hum that every now and then would inexplicably inhabit your hearing for several seconds before disappearing once more. There was no rhyme or reason to it. It was just one of those things, and yet half asleep, Ellie did something she had never before done in her life. She listened to it. Whispers. Her eyes shot open in the darkness. She could hear whispers. She could not understand the words, but she knew, without a doubt, that she could hear voices whispering in the dark. They were so quiet, so shrill, and so distant that she could not place them, but they were definitely audible to her. Well was not a woman to retreat from the unknown, and so unwisely she concentrated harder, her interest now peaked, her mind racing. Was this what crazy people experience when they claim to hear voices in their heads? Were they actually more perceptive than normal people? As LA fought harder to understand the voices, they became more and more aware of her alertness to them. It took only minutes, barely even 5 of them, before the young woman was lost to them forever. Because once you begin to listen, they listen back. And they gain access to your mind, all its hidden corners, all the deep, dark thoughts you keep for yourself and never let anyone know about. And once they know these things, they use them against you. You drive yourself mad from the very core of your mind. Her parents, doctors, and friends blamed her breakdown on the grief of her failed marriage. And though she was seen and treated by many professionals in the years that followed, no one could ever get through to her. Versos and all, because she had stopped and listened. You're doing it now, aren't you? You're trying to hear, you're trying to see from the corner of your eye. You have been since the moment you read what Elle did. You have been trying to tune in to the voices, to hear what they have to say that is so awful that you would lose your sanity. You don't believe it is possible. You are listening now, listening to the darkness. And I am so sorry, my friend. I am truly terribly sorry, because we are listening back. At first, we didn't even understand what was going on. Well, by we, I mean those of us who do not hold degrees in astronomy and quantum physics. We were told that Earth's spin was slowing and would come to a full stop in less than 5 years. The first real hint that something was going on was the sudden malfunction of all the GPS systems worldwide. Flights were shut down, and those of us who were raised in the computer age couldn't even find our way to work without it. It was about the second week when everything really started to go wrong. The oceans began flowing towards the poles. It really didn't seem like much, but it gave me a horrible feeling, and I began to realize that something terrible was happening, and there was nothing any of us could do about it. No one really knew why we were suddenly losing our spin, but rather, everyone had wild guesses. Some were saying that the experiments to dig to the center of the Earth caused the magma in the core to stop flowing. Another attempt to blame the government, I supposed. Then there was the theory that our moon had fallen too far out of our magnetic field, causing chaos within the electromagnetic field that surrounded the Earth. Lastly, of course, there was the theory that aliens were to blame. However, in reality, there were no real reasons. There was no forthcoming admission from the government or from aliens, and the moon sure as hell wasn't talking. The 3rd month was when the looting started. As the oceans continued to flood the polar ice caps, the air in the tropics and certain cities of higher altitude soon became unbreathable. The scientists said it had something to do with the actual shape of the Earth, but I really couldn't wrap my head around the whole concept. All I know is as people began to evacuate, people were being robbed at gunpoint, stores were having everything taken from them, and the stock market crashed. That was it. It took 3 months of us being under siege by an unknown and unnamed assailant for the world to fall into chaos. Humanity was losing everything that made them humane. I guess it really hit us around the 4th or 5th month of slowing. The Earth was spinning at 225 kilometers per hour less than normal. The days were 48 hours long and the nights were as well. By now, the Earth had fallen into a complete state of misanthropy. Humans were no longer welcome. The earthquakes started up, they were hitting places that made no sense and that had never seen earthquakes before. Long dead volcanoes were suddenly spewing ash and magma in torrents. Thousands were dying, and they were not even going to be the last. As the oceans continued to move, Britain became connected to mainland Europe, something that had never been seen before. Ireland was part of England, Cuba was connected to Florida, and Mexico was 3 times its original size. The upheaval was throwing everything off, and fear and panic began to strike everyone. And even worse, only the top and bottom third of the globe were habitable. The air around the equator was basically non-existent. Not even the hardiest mountain climber could live there. It would have been like living somewhere 3 times the height of Mount Everest. With that came the solar radiation. That part was easy for all of us to understand. Stand in the sun more than 15 minutes and you die. Pretty simple, right? Only at first we didn't realize it. Did you know that the electromagnetic field prevents us from experiencing the worst of solar radiation and solar flares? Neither did I. I also didn't know that that same field is caused by Earth turning. Those who did stand outside too long died. While the lucky ones did, the others developed radiation sickness. It was horrible to watch. It was like those old videos of Hiroshima. By the time 2.5 years had rolled around, the horrors that we had seen were like nothing you could possibly imagine. It is impossible to describe the low that humankind had fallen to and what was seen by us at that low. Those people who had stayed in England, Russia, and Germany had died. As the water began to suck up part of the northern hemisphere, even American cities as low as New York and Chicago were gone. 6 billion people were wiped out. That is a number I cannot even begin to fathom. Our days were more than 125 hours long. That means it is light for more than 60 hours. Our brains weren't even being given a chance. With that, the hallucinations were setting in, And the survivors of the radiation sickness had it the worst. They became the true version of zombies. They were eating people and living in cold, damp caves. They crawl out during the twilight hours, which last days now, and stalk people. They look for food wherever they can get it, which is usually not from animals. Seeing as all the migratory species have died out, and the non-migratory animals are smart enough to stay away. Braces. Even now, as we approach the 5th year, where it is light for 6 months and night for 6 months, these creatures continue to stalk us. Very few humans have chosen to band together. You never know when your partner is going to begin hallucinating from the lack of sleep and be caught out too long during the day. I had such a partner, and it was the hardest thing I ever had to do when I walked away from him. However, no matter how much you love your children, a monster is a monster. I don't really even know why I am writing this, other than in hopes that if there is anything out there in the cosmos, any living sentient being, they can understand what happened to us. I heard that there is a megacontinent that opened up down by Florida, where air is still breathable for now, and there are seas in which to fish for food. But I don't know if I can make it. I want to. But in all honesty, I am so tired, and it is hard to discern reality from fiction, and it is starting to get darker during the day. I know those creatures will be back, with their skin falling from their bodies and their hair missing patches. A real nightmare though, knowing that this will never end. And if it does, none of us will survive. So please, if you see me, kill me. People sometimes ask me what my first memory is. Invariably I lie, because I'm prone to avoid the explanation that comes with the truth. Maybe, from now on, if someone casually asks me what is your first memory, I will reach into my bag where there will be copies of this story, and I will just hand one over. As they read it, their face will morph from confusion into the furrowed brow of concern, and finally into the drop-jawed bewilderment that accompanies real fear, a passing. I tell people that my first memory was of me standing on a stool in front of my kitchen window. It was just after dusk in winter, and from where I stood, I could make out the black limbs of the skeletal beech tree that loomed from across the driveway. Well, that is indeed a real memory. It's not the first one. If you want to hear about that, here it is. There was an unfortunate series of incidences that happened in the town where I grew up during the summer of 1989. By incidences, I mean murders. I'm not talking about your run-of-the-mill bar brawl, gone too far, or an act of passionate revenge. No. The events that happened in Middleton were far more grotesque. Even more so because the victims were children. I don't remember the heat wave that had swept Middleton that summer. The pink droplets of melted ice cream on the simmering pavement, or old men reclined in overstuffed chairs in shady living rooms. These precious details were told to me through family members and friends of my parents. They all to this day say that it was the hottest summer they have ever lived through. To make the weather even more unbearable, there were weekly brownouts that year due to some oversights at the electric plant in Salem. As a result, homes and businesses would go for hours at a time without air conditioning. Popsicles were promptly sold out in every business after noon. Magazines and newspapers weren't read that summer. They were bought to be used as makeshift fans. It seemed that the only place where air conditioning still remained during these outages was the car. Been told by relatives that it was not uncommon during that summer to find neighbors lounging back in their parked cars with the windows up, drinking a beer and listening to the radio. At times it was the only escape from the unbearable humidity and heat. That's why when mothers would go shopping, it became impossible to pull their children from their cars. After all, the kids knew that the inside of whatever clothing or grocery store their mother had taken them to was probably as hot, if not hotter, than the parking lot. The coolest and best place to be was in the car, with the windows rolled up and that gentle whispering wind seeping through the vents. With this setting in mind, you can understand how Mr. Teeth, as he was later called by newspapers, had his pick of the litter, so to speak. He knew that in any given lot outside of a busy grocery or department store, there would be at least 2 or 3 cars where the children had been left inside. One such car was parked outside of the Market Basket on the afternoon of June 3rd. Within sat Jeremy Hager, a freckled 8-year-old with a penchant for action figures. When Jeremy's mother returned from her quick dash for butter, she found the back right door of the vehicle ajar, a Darth Vader doll left abandoned on the back seat. News of the disappearance radiated through the town over the following week, up until the day when a jogger noticed a small black Reebok laying in the grass on the edge of the reservoir. Not long afterward, Jeremy's body was pulled from the brown water and sent to the morgue. It was there that doctors noted what appeared to be bite marks on the boy's arms and neck. Victim number 2 was Amanda Demiller, a girl of 7 who had fallen asleep on her way home from shopping with her mother on July 18th. As was common in those days, a parent might leave their sleeping child in the car once at home. Britta Demiller, Amanda's mother, later told police that with the house being as hot as it was, she had thought that Amanda would sleep better in the car with the sliding side door left open. At some point, Mrs. DeMiller looked out the window to see that Amanda was no longer in her seat. The family lived on a fairly wooded road leading into the forest of Middleton. Neighbors were widely separated from one another. Mr. and Mrs. DeMiller spent all of that night scouring the narrow back roads, knocking on the doors of the occasional houses. After only a 3-day search, a local boy found Amanda's body slumped in the corner of his treehouse. Her throat was purple from strangulation and covered with bite marks. Her shoes were on the wrong feet. Anyway, that's how the story goes. That brings us to my first memory. My parents have since placed the date of this memory to around the 3rd or 4th week of August. It had been about a month since Amanda DeMiller's murder, but no one had been apprehended. People in town were still on edge. It was at that time, one afternoon when I sat in the front seat of my mom's rusty Toyota parked in the giant lot of Henry's grocery store. I remember that there was a car parked on either side of my mother's, and in front of the Toyota was one of those corrals for shopping carts. There was music playing quietly on the radio, Madonna. Maybe, and my hands were sticky from eating candy. You may wonder how. With all of the horrors that had plagued Middleton that summer, my mother could have left me alone in the car. The fact is, she hadn't. My older brother, Stephen Aj, 12 at the time, had been designated as my temporary guardian while she made an emergency stop for flour. It was this temporary guardian who decided that this was the perfect opportunity to run to the bookstore nearby to buy a deck of collectible cards. Before he dashed out of the back seat, I remember him saying something like, "Don't go anywhere." So there I sat, waiting for one or both of my family members to return. It was then that I saw him, and it's this part, which is clear even to this day. The halogen lamps had just come on all across the lot. They cast that greenish glow from just being turned on. The sky beyond the pines that bordered the market was streaked with pink and purple. It must have been around 7:30. I remember first seeing him standing there some 30 feet from the front of our car. Almost instantly, the music from the radio faded from my ears along with the sharp rattle of carriage wheels on the old pavement. Transfixed, stay silent. I stared out the windshield at this lanky, gaunt figure framed by pink and purple sky. Through a curtain of greasy black hair falling across his brow, I discerned a single eye. It seemed to sort of take on the green glow of those halogen lights. He tilted his head back a bit and the hint of a smile danced across his thin lips. He must have stood and stared through the windshield at me, transfixed and spellbound as I was for one whole minute. He then started a slow walk over to my side of the car, never taking his eye from mine. Once he was outside my door, he looked down his long beak-like nose at me. Then looking around, he began to wiggle the handle. "Open up," he said, looking down at me again. I just stared at him without saying anything. Again, "Open up." His long skeletal fingers left the door handle and started to dance across my window, tapping here and there. He crouched down so that he was at my level and started a sort of puppet show with his hands. His dirty fingers dashed across the glass like great pale spiders in a deadly battle. He looked at them and laughed, making hissing and growling sounds. As he made these sounds, his mouth opened up into a full grin, and I had a look inside at rows of long yellow teeth. They are, to this day, the longest and largest teeth I've ever seen. There were gaps between them, and they reminded me vaguely of dirty piano keys. He seemed to be completely immersed in his spider battle, giggling and clawing at each of his hands. At one point, he noticed that my window was open just a crack at the top. He looked at me grinning with those mighty teeth and crawled one of his hand spiders up to the space. I was openly sobbing at this point. He managed to squeeze the tips of 4 fingers through the opening. I caught a greasy whiff of unwashed clothes mingled with the sweet scent of blood. "Come on, open up," he said in a whiny, pleading voice. "Open up." He said this same sentence in a dozen different voices, from a girly voice to a thick lumberjack one. By sheer luck, the woman who was parked on the passenger side of our car returned with all 4 of her noisy kids in tow. Upon seeing her, the man scurried off in a ducked walk towards the cart corral, where he smoothly stood up straight and walked off into the parking lot, but not before looking over his shoulder, gnashing those massive teeth, and catching me with one final blood-chilling stare. The memory ends there. It was later explained to me that my brother had returned to the car to find me crying hysterically, no matter what he said to calm me through the glass. Apparently, I wouldn't unlock the doors. My mother returned soon after. She said that all I could manage to say through thick sobs was, "There was a man." I just kept repeating it for hours after that. There was a man. Like the insufferable heat, so too did the Middleton murders come to an end with the changing of the seasons. Just 2 weeks after my parking lot encounter, the child killer, who was later identified as Raymond Sandler, aged 29, was caught after taking a young girl from a birthday party at a roller rink in Beverly. A worker on his coffee break at the adjacent gas station. saw a thin man lead the girl out the back door of the rink and attempt to force her into a red car. The worker called the cops and the car was pulled over on Route 128, just outside of Gloucester. While I don't remember it, I first made the connection between the man in the parking lot and Mr. Teeth by seeing my father's newspaper on the coffee table the day after Sandler's capture. There, in a large blown-up black and white, was the same ghastly face I'd seen just inches from mine with only a layer of glass separating us. Apparently, I didn't make it to school the day I saw that newspaper on account of I couldn't stop screaming. Knowing that I had almost been a victim myself, my family and people around Middleton weren't willing to tell me anything about the killer once I grew curious, years later. I suppose they didn't want to freak me out more than I already was. So in high school, I did some of my own research. I learned that the Boston Globe had first coined the nickname Mr. Teeth both on account of Sandler's unusually large incisors and his habit of biting the skin of his victims. His means of killing was almost exclusively strangulation. Due to his being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Sandler was often delusional. As a result, his story regularly changed. However, after being asked several times, the number of murders he confessed to, while varying, never went above 10. It was also noted in research on Sandler that he only hunted in the summertime. Some speculated that this was because of the easy access to children who had been left in cool cars while their parents went in to shop. Others suggested that the hot weather triggered something inside of Sandler, something that lay dormant during the fall and winter, then awoke once the temperature hit 80. Who can say? The years have softened that first memory a bit. I'm almost 40 now, and while that hideous grin isn't quite as distinct as it used to be, I still see it sometimes when I wake up at night, usually in the warmer months. Someday, one of my two girls, who know nothing of the summer of '89, may ask when they're older, "Hey Dad, what's your first memory?" Maybe I'll tell them about the time I was on the stool in my kitchen looking out at the old beech tree. Or maybe I'll just say teeth. I remember teeth. Growing up, my dad would tell me scary stories. Once he claimed he experienced during his childhood, his stories would both fascinate and terrify me. As I grew older, the stories he would share became less frequent until they eventually came to an end. Maybe because I stopped believing. Rye had come to the conclusion that in a fun, twisted way, he was just finding enjoyment by filling my young imagination with haunted visions. However, after a recent trip home, my mind has been changed. I believe him and think his childhood stories are more rooted in reality than I would like to admit. Earlier this month, I returned home from college for a quick weekend visit with the family. I was sitting on the living room couch and my dad in his cozy recliner. We were flipping channels when we stopped on one of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. That's when I asked him if he remembered the scary stories he would tell me as a kid. I was expecting a smiled response, but to my surprise, he seemed oddly serious. I chuckled out loud at his reaction, but with a straight face. My dad looked directly at me and said, "Everything he once told me was the truth." We continued to talk, and he reminded me that his family had moved to a small town in Mississippi when he was about 8 years old. The house across the street was vacant, boarded up, and he would quickly come to discover it was haunted. It was 2 stories and sat tilted like it could collapse at any moment. His parents would warn him to stay away, but that did not stop his curiosity. It was not until several years later that the house was demolished, mysteriously leaving behind only the front wooden staircase and a stone-covered well on the now eerie open field property. He thought that once the house was gone, things might be normal. He had experienced enough strange encounters firsthand, and also through stories his group of young friends would share amongst each other. But he said it wasn't just the house, nor the oddities that took place in his neighborhood, but the entire town he grew up in was far from ordinary. The more I listened to him talk, the more I started to believe again. I asked him to tell me one of his many Halloween stories. He obliged, asking if I remembered the one about the disappearance of his best friend Jake, an event that still haunts him to this day. My parents would never let me go out trick or treating alone, even in high school, and I remember this caused me quite some embarrassment with my friends. I joked with him, saying all he did was shelter me from having adolescent Halloween fun. "You can blame my apocalypsis," he responded. I had never heard that word before, so I asked him what it meant. He sounded like something he made up. "Google it," he said. "Believe it or not, there's a phobia for everything, even for your most obscure fears." My dad continued, saying he just wanted to be a good parent. He was only trying to protect me, to ensure I returned home safe and was in bed by night's end. He has never forgotten about his friend Jake and the Halloween they spent out in the park, waiting for the O-Lantern Man. Jake was my dad's first friend when he moved to the small river town. They met at school and would spend most of their free time hanging out around the neighborhood. Jake conveniently lived just a couple of streets away. As they grew older, Jake quickly garnered the reputation of being the bad boy, and he was always up to trouble and began spending more time in detention than in class. There are some stories my dad would rather not share with me, mostly because he was a bit ashamed of his behavior, but Jake's antics would occasionally influence his decisions for the worse. One day, Jake vanished. He stopped showing up for class freshman year of high school, and the rumors circulating around town were that he was sent to boarding school. His house was deserted and soon had a for sale sign out in the front yard. Roughly a year or so passed, and a lot of my dad's questions about what had happened to Jake went unanswered. That is until Halloween night when Jake made a sudden reappearance. My dad had been left home alone as his parents attended an adults-only Halloween party. He promised them he would stay inside the house and hand out candy to the trick-or-treaters. Only moments after his parents departed, there was a knock at the door. Expecting a group of kids in costumes, my dad was in shock and disbelief to see Jake standing on the porch. He was chomping down on a piece of candy, dressed in dark clothing with ripped jeans, and sported a backwards hat. It had been about a year, but my dad said Jake looked exactly the same. Jake wanted nothing to do with answering questions about his whereabouts. Instead, he pushed, teased, and under relentless peer pressure convinced my dad to accept a dare to play a Halloween variation of the game Chicken. The rules were simple: see who could stay out the latest on Halloween night. Without running home scared, Jake was acting very strange that night. The two weren't speaking much, so to kill some time they ended up strolling around the neighborhood, searching for houses with candy bowls left outside. Their final stop that Halloween was at the local park a few blocks down. It was located on the darkened outskirts of the neighborhood, tucked away from the houses. My dad and Jake would frequent this spot growing up. It had a little league baseball field, and during the summers, the two would spend hours playing home run derby and hang out in the dugout. My dad remembers it being a brisk October night. As they walked through the park, all he could hear was silence and the sounds of chirping crickets that echoed in the surrounding fields. There were no lights, and other than the glow of the nearly full moon above, the park was an eerie pitch black. My dad kept wondering how the night would end. He tried thinking up several ways to scare Jake, determined to bring an end to the stupid game of Halloween Chicken, but nothing clever came to mind. It was going to take more than jumping out from behind a corner to send Jake running in fear. The two arrived at the baseball field, only spending a few minutes sitting on the steel dugout bed, before Jake stood up and began pacing back and forth. Something visibly had him on edge. My dad continued to press Jake for an explanation, to answer why they were sitting out in the cold, why Jake had come back so suddenly, on Halloween of all nights. When Jake noticed my dad was wearing a wristwatch, he became obsessed with asking for updates regarding the time. He first asked around 11:00 p.m., followed by the same question almost every 5 minutes thereafter. Finally, my dad said enough was enough. Jake was driving him insane. He grabbed Jake by the shirt collar and pressed him up against the dugout fence. One last time, my dad demanded answers, but Jake remained silent. That's when my dad finally gave up and decided it was time to go home. To this day, he is still haunted by some of Jake's final words. As he took his first step outside the dugout, he heard Jake begin to softly speak. "Be home by midnight on Halloween night, or the O-Lantern Man will sense your fright. For all bad souls who are not in bed, O-Lantern Man will snatch your head. And with your head, he will cast a spell. A pumpkin you shall be, from now until next Hallows Eve." He's real. Jake shouted, "He's not some stupid folklore Halloween tale to scare us. The warnings are true. I have seen him with my own 2 eyes. I swear to God, O-Lantern Man is real." My dad admits his emotions caught up to him. He was freaked out by Jake's odd behavior and his urban legend warning. He did not know what to believe, and it was late. He knew he should be home, not out alone in the park. Rather than encourage Jake's bizarre behavior, my dad decided to say goodnight and continued on his way. Jake yelled out, requesting one final update for the time. My dad glanced at his watch. It was midnight, but this time he decided not to answer. He was only a short way up the gravel path. When Jake let out a horrified gasp, my dad turned around and could see Jake pointing out in the direction of the outfield grass. "Do you see it?" Jake whispered out loud. My dad peered out into the surrounding darkness and in the distance could see a faint flickering light. He stood still watching as the mysterious glow moved closer. Attempting to get Jake's attention, my dad shouted out several times that it was time to leave, but Jake was stuck in a trance, continuing to mumble the warning out loud. "Be home by midnight on Halloween night, or the O-Lantern Man will sense your fright for all bad souls who are not in bed. O-Lantern Man will snatch your head, now rescind on your CD." The light shined brighter, moving closer with each passing second. My dad was frozen in fear, blinded by the orange blaze. It was now just outside the dugout, directly in front of Jake. A loud and high-pitched crackling laugh echoed through the park. In a sudden moment of awareness, Jake began to run for his life. My dad says it was hard to see who or what was hiding behind the light, but he caught a glimpse of what looked like a fire-lit jack-o'-lantern, carved out with an evil, sinister face. The two friends ran together side by side as fast as they could, away from the park and back into the neighborhood. My dad, who was quicker than Jake, continued speeding ahead. My dad approached the porch of his house. He could hear Jake screaming in the distance, but at the moment he could only think for his own safety and barreled his way into the house, locking the door behind him. He called out for his parents, but they were still gone. He was alone. He debated calling the police, but before he could make any rational decision, there was a loud thud at the door. He could hear Jake screaming for help. My dad raced down the stairs towards the front door, but the loud cries quickly became a disturbing silence. Nervous to unlock the door, he shouted out several times for Jake to respond, but there was no answer. Mustering up the courage to slowly crack the door open, my dad peeked outside. He glanced around and was suddenly shaken by yet another mysterious discovery. On the porch, piled on top the welcome mat, was a dark shirt, ripped blue jeans, a pair of empty shoes, and a baseball hat. He recognized them as Jake's belongings. The same exact items he was wearing that Halloween night, and hidden underneath the clothes was a giant orange pumpkin. To this day, my dad is still unsure if it was a well-thought-out prank or if he and Jake had indeed encountered some kind of evil entity that Halloween. But one thing my dad does know for certain, he never saw Jake again. I jokingly teased my dad about the O-Lantern Man story, and I tried to get him to admit the absurdity of the urban legend, but he held on to his truth. He insisted that the more he thought about it, the more he believed Jake was genuinely scared that night, that something terrible had happened to him. Something unexplainable. We aimlessly asked him about the pumpkin, the one he found on his porch hidden beneath Jake's stuff. What happened to it? If he believed the urban legend to be true, did he save the pumpkin thinking it could be Jake? My dad said he left everything outside that night. He was so scared, he locked the door and ran straight to his room to hide in his bed. In the morning, his parents asked him what happened to the front porch. They seemed upset, and my dad played dumb, hoping that maybe it was all just a nightmare. His parents told him to go take a look, and he remembers nervously trembling as he approached the door. When he stepped outside, he saw that Jake's belongings were still there, but scattered across the entryway and the pumpkin. It had been completely smashed to teenage Halloween vandals. Possibly, he thinks, or if you choose to believe the urban legend, maybe the O-Lantern Man returned to ensure that a bad soul like Jake would never be coming back to celebrate Halloween ever again. Okay, because for Jake, Halloween was never about trick-or-treating, carving pumpkins, dressing up in costumes, or watching scary movies. His idea of Halloween fun was giving in to the impulses of mischief, causing trouble, disobeying his parents, and staying out past midnight. For those who choose to celebrate the Halloween spirit for the wrong and evil reasons, let it be known that there are consequences. The O-Lantern Man will get you. Apocalypse imposes, my dad says again. Only this time he tells me what it means. It's a fear of turning into a pumpkin. It's a real phobia, and because it exists, that means I'm not the only one who has it. I must admit, after hearing my dad recount his Halloween tale and telling it to me today with the same truthful seriousness, I can feel my childhood excitement for horror returning. Once my dad was done, I only had one last question for him. Can you tell me another scary story? We were just some dumb seniors in high school when we found it. A rowdy bunch who barely paid attention in class and spent most of the time just drinking. It was just us. Jonathan, Mason, and Enzo, the hit kids as we were called. On weekends, we would go up in the mountains, find a spot to camp, and drink till the sun came up. It wasn't until our usual camping spot had been snatched that we had to find a new one. We traveled beyond the mountains till we found a spot that resided next to a field. It was near an abandoned farm, and there wasn't much left of the place. The spot was pretty mediocre. There was a lot of trash left from the last campers. Though the field is what made it worth it, tons of space to run around. Before the sun went down, we tried playing football on the field. Turns out the field was practically a death trap, as Mason almost broke his foot when he fell into a soft spot. He sank almost all the way up to his calf, leaving a pretty bad bruise. Night is when we first found it. We ran back into the fields to play another game, only to be pushed back by some invisible force. Dumbfounded by what we found, we tried again as we ran towards the center of the field, only to have Enzo get flung back by the force. The closer you got to the center, the stronger the force was. Very circled the field in every direction. It never got easier no matter where you tried it from. Like how magnets will repel when you put the opposite ends near each other. And needless to say, that night was the best night we ever had challenging each other. to see how far we could get. In our drunken stupor, we would run at top speed only to get flung back. It never got old just watching your drunk friend's body fly through the air. In the morning, the field had seemed to go back to normal. We tried the field again just to see if anything changed, but there was nothing to be found. From then on, we visited that spot every time we went camping, just to see how far we could get to the eye of the storm. Soon we started to get more creative, bringing weights and ice axes. Jonathan once tried a four-wheeler, driving it at full speed into the forest. Needless to say, he ended up in the emergency room that night. In some way, we all kind of knew we were testing fate, messing with a phenomenon we didn't understand. Yet curiosity got the better of us. Just the thought of getting into the eye of the storm was enough to push us to try harder. In the end, none of us could really get to the center, no matter how hard we tried. It wasn't until our last time camping before graduation that everything changed. That time felt different. We were exhausted from finals, just barely getting a C on all our tests. That night was calmer than the rest. None of us really wanted to challenge the force. Mostly we just sat and talked about the last couple of years as we sipped our beers. That night was the last time we were probably ever gonna see each other. I didn't want our last moments together to just be us wallowing in our misery. Something inside me that night was itching to get into that circle just one more try. With a shot of liquid courage, I started to walk towards the field. I could feel everyone's gaze on me. I could hear their hushed whispers, doubting that I'd be the one to make it. Ray had always been the weakest of the group, barely getting anywhere near the center compared to them. This time, though, I wanted to challenge the fates of God. I wanted to reach beyond. Slowly, I walked into the field, the force quickly taking over as I stumbled back, almost falling on my back. Still, I persisted, pushing head-on as I trudged further. Soon I started crawling, gripping the tall grass in front of me as it cut into my skin. Blood started falling from my hands, but the pain only made me want the prize more. I could feel the pressure digging into my chest, but it only made me want to go further. I closed my eyes, only focused on pushing further than ever before. My body was lifted into the air, and the only thing keeping me from flying away was my grip on the earth. The pressure on my chest began to intensify, like God herself was pushing me away. With everything I had left, I reached forward until the pressure finally ceased. Then silence. The earth stood still for just a moment. I was exhausted but overjoyed that I had just made it to the center. Something not even a four-wheeler could have done. The silence was broken as I heard the cheers of my friends as they ran in my directions. Jonathan picked me up, his face ecstatic as he screamed for joy that I had made it. Mason came by as they both put me on their shoulders, chanting underdog as they spun me around. Enzo just stood there, more disappointed than anything else, upset that I had ruined the fun. I had never felt more accomplished than that day. It was as if I had made the final touchdown at the Super Bowl. To this day, I hold that memory in times of struggle. If only I knew my heroic action would be our ruin. Just 2 days later, I got the call. Mason was found dead at his girlfriend's place. I never felt true fear until I saw the mangled corpse of my friend. The chest had been torn outwards, ripping a hole in his chest. His ribcage was shattered and pieces of flesh and bone were scattered across the room. Blood practically coated the walls. His neck was almost torn off his head as it dangled behind the couch. His eyes were gray and hollow, like a filter was coated over them. His face was frozen in a terrified state, as if in his final moments he saw death himself. In the autopsy, it was stated that the lungs were missing and there was no trace of them anywhere. It was like the lungs weren't even there to begin with. The night of his death, Mason's girlfriend, Anna, stated that he was coming to stay the night since her parents were on a business trip. When he got there, though, he was gripping his chest, obviously in pain, believing it must have been something he drank. It lasted all night to the point where he was sweating puddles, trying to keep quiet, so as not to wake the neighbors. No matter what Anna said, she couldn't convince Mason to go to the hospital eventually. She gave up and retired for the night. Her sleep was disturbed by a loud popping noise. When she went to check on him, that's how she found him. It was labeled a homicide, but without any evidence of a break-in. The prime suspect was Anna. She probably would have been found guilty if it wasn't for the second incident. Next came Enzo. It happened when he was buying drugs from his plug's place. The dealer Jack said Enzo came in late, gripping his chest as he entered. He was white as a ghost, staining his carpet with sweat. At moments, he would randomly stagger, almost falling backwards like he was being pushed back. Eventually, Jack gave him a blunt, believing it would help him relax. When he took a hit, Jack watched as the smoke went in but didn't come out. Then Enzo just stopped. His eyes glossed over as he laid almost lifeless on the couch. He whispered something to himself. Jack got close, only able to make out a couple of words. "The hands are cold." Then, like a bomb, his chest tore open as blood, guts and bone flew across the room, drenching Jack in blood. With the second death of Enzo, Jonathan, and I I knew if we didn't do something we were next, we drove back to the spot in the field. There had to be something we missed, something I hadn't seen since that night. When we arrived, I retraced my steps, remembering where and how I managed to get to the center. There was nothing that showed the reason for all of this. Then it hit me that there was nothing from that night. I bled that night while trying to get to the center. It hadn't rained for days. In that case, there should have been dried blood. To the best of my abilities, I found the spot in which I bled and started to dig down. Jonathan joined me as we both frantically dug until our hands went numb. The soil below started to get moist and heavy. Our hands began to turn from brown to red as we quickly discovered we were moving blood. Soon there was more blood than dirt. I plunged my hand into the blood, pushing the saturated soil until I felt it. A slab of flesh under the earth, solid and slick. I could feel it faintly breathing. It took long, raspy breaths. I could feel the blood around my arm slightly rise and fall. We had found God and we had angered her. The forest was never coming from the sky, it was coming from down below. It was its errand in my persistence to challenge her. I had stolen it. Now she's stealing ours, punishing us one by one. Before I could say anything, I looked back at Jonathan to see that there was fear in his eyes as he was grabbing his chest. We rubbed our hands in the grass, trying to clean the blood off before we rushed to the car. As we drove, he told me it felt like a great hand was digging into him. It got worse, no matter how hard he tried to fake it. I could tell he was in serious pain. Finally, we arrived at the nearest emergency room as I pleaded with the receptionist to get Jonathan a doctor. As soon as we got a room, he started turning white as his eyes glossed over. He went into an almost trance-like state, oblivious to any of my words. Then he snapped as he screamed at me that this was my fault, how I was the one who had to test God and damn us all. He jumped from his bed as he grabbed me, digging his nails into my chest. Staff had to restrain him and strap him to the bed. Only then was the doctor able to get a scan of his chest. What I saw both amazed and terrified me at the same time. In the scan, there were the outlines of two hands slowly moving their way towards the lungs. They were practically rearranging Jonathan's insides as they simply pushed the other organs out of the way. The hands slowly inched their way to the center of the lungs. With every push, Jonathan reacted with a painful groan. But after a couple of minutes, they managed to reach the eye of the storm, gripping his lungs. Then all at once, Jonathan went gray as his eyes turned the same shade. He looked at me with defeat and anger sprawled on his face. All he said was, "It's so cold." I didn't watch him. I couldn't do it. I left the room as I heard the crunching sound of flesh and bone tear, followed by the screams of the doctor. Right as they drove home as the crunching sound of Jonathan played in my head on repeat, I grabbed a shovel, a lamp, and my dad's old beat-up shotgun. He kept in the shed before I headed back into the field. By the time I got there, it was pitch black. I could barely recognize the spot. I stumbled into the fields, feeling the old familiar force. I pushed and repeated the actions I had done that same night. But even with the added weight, I still failed to reach the center. With every attempt, I managed to get further away. No matter what I did, I couldn't get back, and with every attempt, I was exerting myself. Then came my worst fear as I felt the cool touch on my chest. I didn't have much time left. Only then did I leave the lamp and shovel, bringing only the shotgun strapped to my back. I closed my eyes as I walked, pushing away any feelings of fear and loss, only focused on the eye of the storm. With everything I had left, I pushed forwards until I was crawling on all fours, until I was gripping the earth, until my hands began to bleed, until finally, with one final push, the force ceased. I fell to the ground exhausted, but still determined. With what little I had left, I dug into the earth. The pressure on my chest became more intense as I felt the hands trying to tear into my flesh. The deeper I went, the bloodier it got until finally I reached the bottom again. I plunged my hand into the blood, feeling for flesh. Instead, I felt a large fleshy tube. With both hands, I ripped the tube upwards just past the blood. In my hands, I watched it rise and fall as air flowed through, rapidly increasing. It was the trachea, the center of the lungs. I was ready to tear the thing apart before I dropped it. As I grabbed at my chest, I could feel it gripping my lungs. My body went cold as my vision began to blur. I swung my shotgun into my hands, blindly unloading on the hole below. The earth shook as blood splattered back into my face. With every shot, I could feel the rumble of screams that came below. And I didn't stop until the pressure in my chest eased, and my vision started to clear. I fell back exhausted as I closed my eyes, eventually passing out on the cool grass. I awoke to the warmth of the rising sun. One last time, I plunged my hand into the earth, feeling for any sign of life. God was dead. A time went on, and eventually the field shriveled up and died in a matter of a couple of days. The forest followed as well. No form of life could be found for miles. As for me, life went on, and eventually I learned to put the past behind me. For the longest time, I lived in contentment, unafraid of God ever coming back. It was until late last night that I felt the cool touch of God on my chest More, I'm too far from the fields to stop her. In the end, she won. She's been waiting so long for this moment to finally get revenge. I feel it now, the cold hand of death gripping my lungs, ready to pull at any moment, yet she's making me wait. Whether she is enjoying this moment, savoring every second before it takes me, or if she's waiting for me to finish this, to tell the world never to make the same mistake as I have. I can take my life, but I'm not giving it the satisfaction of fear. From that glimmer of strength I still have from that night, from the memory of my friends holding me up in celebration, I'll face her with everything I've got. A young boy and his sister who are left home alone when their parents go out for the night. As their mother was leaving, she told her children not to open the door under any circumstances. If anyone knocks, don't answer it, she told them. But the boy and his sister didn't pay attention to their mother's warning. They thought she was being too careful. They figured they could take care of themselves in any situation. About an hour after the parents left, the kids heard a knock on the front door. They decided to ignore it, but again they heard knock. It happened again, and it grew louder each time. Eventually, the girl couldn't stand it anymore, and she told her brother she was going to answer the door. When the boy reminded her of their mother's warning, the girl just wouldn't listen. Again, they heard the knock on the door. Finally, the sister went downstairs. Her brother lay on the sofa watching TV. He heard his sister's footsteps walking down the stairs. He heard her asking loudly, "Who is it?" He heard her open the lock on the front door. Then he heard only silence. He lay there for a while listening for any noise but heard nothing. Eventually, he started getting scared. His sister still hadn't returned. He was afraid to call out to his sister, so he sneaked out the back door and made his way to their neighbor's house. When he went into their house, his neighbor was watching the local news channel on TV. The news anchor on TV was talking about a murder. Then they showed a reporter live at the scene of the murder. The neighbor said to the boy, "Hey, that looks like your house." The boy was shaking with fear. "That is my house," he said. "And that's my front door?" When I was in 6th grade, our entire class went on a school trip. All of the kids in the class were taking pictures with cameras and phones. When we returned to school, we were browsing through the photographs when, all of a sudden, one girl said, "OMG." "What's that?" Everyone scrambled to see what she was looking at. In the photograph, one of the boys in our class was sitting on the bus. There didn't seem to be anything strange about the picture until you looked very closely at his reflection in the window. His face in the reflection looked as if it was yellow and bulging, bubbling and mutating, and there appeared to be a strange white shape floating beside him. When you turned the picture upside down, you realized it was a skull. It was horrific. When the boy saw the photograph of himself, he burst into tears and had a panic attack. Everyone else in the class began to freak out. The teacher had to send the boy to the school nurse, and the principal banned all of us from speaking about the strange photo. Everyone was scared. 7 days later, the boy died of a brain tumor. When I was in elementary school, my father would often take me hiking in the mountains. One night we had stayed out too long and it began to grow dark. A thick fog drifted over the hillside and we could barely see the path in front of us. My father was holding my hand to make sure I didn't fall. As we made our way down the slope, I noticed a small shadowy figure appearing out of the mist on the path up ahead. My father suddenly squeezed my hand very tightly. "Now, Dad!" "That hurts," I cried. My father looked down at me. His face was grim. "Close your eyes," he barked, "and don't open them again until I say so." His tone of voice was so stern that I did as I was told without questioning it. He kept a tight grip on my hand, and with my eyes tightly shut, I stumbled along beside him through the fog. When we passed the spot where the shadow figure had been, I heard a small voice muttering, "Die, die, die," the rest of the way down. My father was silent, and it wasn't until we got back home that he finally allowed me to open my eyes. Since that time, he refused to speak about the incident. 20 years later, I paid my father a visit. He was drinking some alcohol, and we were having a heart-to-heart conversation. Something reminded me of the strange incident on the mountain path, and I decided to ask him about it. "Remember that small, shadowy figure in the fog?" I said. "Who was it?" My father was silent for a quite while, and eventually, in a low voice, he replied, "It was you." With that, he refilled his glass and refused to discuss it any further. There was a young girl whose parents didn't have very much money. She was the youngest of 3 sisters, and she always had to use hand-me-downs from her siblings. All of her clothes were worn and threadbare because they were second-hand. Even the red bag she brought to school every day was torn and tattered. The girl asked her mother to buy her a new bag, but her mother said it was impossible, they just couldn't afford it. One day, the girl was walking down the street. when she spotted a shiny new red school bag lying in the grass by the side of the road. Looking inside, she found that it didn't have any name on it, and she wondered who it belonged to. Suddenly, the girl thought this bag must be a gift from God. The girl took the red bag home and hid in the room. She was worried that if her mother saw it, she would tell her to bring it back. In the middle of the night, while her mother was fast asleep, the girl got up and transferred the contents of her old bag into the new one. "Tomorrow, I will go to school with my new red bag," she said to herself. Suddenly, the red school bag began to move, and it started biting the girl's feet. She was so shocked that she couldn't cry out, and the pain caused her to faint. When the mother went into her room the next day, the girl was nowhere to be seen. All that remained was one shiny new red bag with no name on the inside. Last year, I was flying home from a business trip, and when my plane was delayed in an unfamiliar city, forced to spend the night there, I searched online and booked a cheap hotel that was close to the airport. When I arrived at the hotel, I was disappointed by how dirty and shabby it was. I thought about trying to find another hotel, but everything was fully booked that weekend. When I got to my room, there was a heavy, unpleasant smell in the air. The whole atmosphere felt stifling and cold. I pulled back the bedclothes and found something strange on the sheets beneath. It was a pair of rusty metal scissors. "Ugh, this is terrible," I said to myself. "The maid hasn't even bothered to clean the room properly." West and Cheryl, I picked them up in disgust and placed them on the bedside table. I was so tired that I couldn't stay awake. I went to bed and decided I would complain about the scissors in the morning. Lying between the dirty sheets, I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep. In the middle of the night, I had an unusual dream. I felt a heavy weight pressing down on me, and I got the strangest feeling that someone was watching me. I'm not sure what time I woke up, but the room was still pitch black. When I reached out and switched on the bedside lamps, my hair stood on end. The rusty scissors were lying on my chest, and the blades were closed on either side of my neck, digging into the skin. One more inch and the scissors would have cut my throat. When my father retired from his job, he had a lot of time on his hands. He began looking around for something to occupy himself. That space at the end of the hallway is such a waste. He said, we could turn it into a storage room. My father was like a man possessed, and he spent 2 days working on his new project. He hung 2 shelves on the wall and fitted a door, creating a small cupboard at the end of the hallway. When I came home the next day, he was nowhere to be seen, and I noticed that there was a shiny new padlock on the door of the storage room. The following evening, my father still hadn't returned. My mother was very anxious and begged me to look inside the storage room. Both of us were wondering what he was keeping in there. I broke the padlock and opened the door. Inside, we found my father sitting on the floor. His eyes were vacant and he was laughing softly to himself. What was he doing? How did he lock the door from the inside? We never got an answer to our questions because my father had gone insane. Today, he is still sitting alone in his storage room, staring into space and smiling happily to himself. Several months prior, Yoko, a friend, and I decided to spend the night at a girl's home whom I was barely acquainted with. Her name was Imai, a childhood friend of Yoko's. Emmy was a peculiar and mostly silent girl. We were alone at her residence as her parents had departed for the night. We changed into our sleeping attire and attempted to share ghost story, although our knowledge of them was limited and the ones we knew lacked intrigue. Suddenly, Emmy, who had been quiet, mentioned knowing a website filled with frightening tales. She introduced us to a site teeming with harrowing stories from around the globe, including Japan. One story in particular drew Yoko's curiosity, but Emmy warned it was perilous, and her demeanor became serious. Emmy insisted that the stories on this website were dangerous, especially the one Yoko pointed to, and were not meant for children. A particular story with an eerie image and a claim that it was written by a non-human entity piqued our interest but stirred discomfort within me. Despite our reluctance, Emi played the story, which had a bizarre voice that prompted Yoko and me to wait it out in the bathroom. It was more a poem than a story and left Emmy looking strange after we returned. We retired shortly after, and I, being a light sleeper in foreign environments, was awakened by Emi's restless murmurs and unsettling sleep talk. Her movements were puppet-like, and her appearance sent a chill down our spines when she turned to us, her face being an abhorrent mix of her own and another's. The events left Yoko and me in a state of fear and blankness. The morning revealed Emmy's disappearance, leaving us frightened and eager to leave her home. Attempts to reach her were futile, and even her mother was clueless about her whereabouts. A missing person report was filed, but no trace of Emmy was found. Police interrogations yielded no results as Yoko and I were certain that Emmy didn't just run away. In our search for the eerie website and the disturbing story, we were met with a notice of the story's removal due to its dangerous nature. Ever since, sleep has been elusive, with the fear of disappearing lingering in my mind.